Welcome to Prep and Play, where we have conversations about safer sexual pleasure. This podcast is dedicated to empowering listeners through open, honest discussions surrounding keeping our minds, bodies, and spirits healthy while being sexually active. My name is Danielle, and I am the Rural Outreach Specialist at AIDS Alabama South. And today we're going all in talking about anal health and pleasure with somebody who knows a lot about it. Dr. Kuttner, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Brian Kuttner. I'm a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx in New York.
I had the pleasure of taking a workshop with Brian last year, and I learned a lot about it. Yeah, I guess let's just jump right in so you can hear a lot of the stuff that I learned from Brian. First up, we're going to be talking about pleasure and specifically why anal sex can be pleasurable for all genders. So let's start at the root here. Why can anal sex be pleasurable for both men and women?
Yes, anatomically speaking. Okay, great. So the anatomical answer is that there are sources of pleasure in that region of the body. And I can give an example of this for your listeners. If your listeners just take the palm of their hand and with a finger from another hand, just gently touch the palm of their hand, just rub that, and then flip their hand over and then touch the top of their hand, they may notice that there's a difference in sensation. And so, one reason that anal pleasure occurs is because the anus is very densely packed with nerve endings, like the palm of the hand, but in a slightly different way. So, it's just very sensitive to touch. So, the quote, right kind of touch from someone that you're aroused by or attracted to can feel really pleasurable that way. And then there are a couple of other sources of pleasure that are important. So, if someone has a prostate is located about, if you go past the opening of the butt, the anus, about 2 inches in and toward the belly button, you'll be able to feel the prostate if someone has one of those. It feels a little spongy. It's about the size of a walnut, but it's not hard. It's more squishy than that. But pressure against the prostate also is really pleasurable. And that's because the sensation of orgasm in people who have a prostate, that is what is responsible for the sense of orgasm. So it's the squeezing of muscles around the prostate. So you can imagine if you're applying pressure from the inside of the body against the prostate, that can be pleasurable. And then another source of pleasure is that people who have a clitoris, the clitoris is a pretty extensive organ. And it's also, what I've learned is it's the only organ in the human body whose sole purpose is pleasure. So it's pretty enviable if you've got one of those. The clitoris, even though like what I was taught early on in my life was that the clitoris is just like what's beneath the hood, just like a little button there. But actually, that's just the part that you can see. It extends with some legs and some bulbous part of it too that extends back into the body. And those extensions also reach back toward the rectum. And in a similar spot to where the prostate would sit, you can reach into the rectum a couple of inches, move toward the belly button with a little bit of pressure, and you can stimulate the legs of the clitoris that way. And then the last way, I said there are two more, but there's actually one more, which is the sensation of fullness inside of the rectum. Some people find pleasurable too. And you might notice this if you just have a very like full bowel movement and you release it, the movement of that going through the rectum, the sense of fullness can also be pleasurable. So those are the main anatomical sources that I've learned about.
Awesome, awesome. And so, outside of our physiological anatomy, what role do our brains and mindsets play in how we experience anal pleasure?
Yeah, this is a good one. So, in the same way I asked people to rub the palm of your hand with your other hand. Well, I have lived in New York City for a while, so there's a lot of unwanted touching that happens in New York City on the subway just because people are bumping into one another. So, you can imagine like, someone on the subway you don't know suddenly rubbing your hand. Maybe not so pleasurable. I mean, it might be something that you are aroused by because it's a stranger, but in general, unwanted touching is not something that people really enjoy. People want to feel a sense of connection, even if it's anonymous, a sense of connection with another person or people. So even though I've described these anatomical sources of pleasure, it's not like a button that you press. It's not like, apply pressure and suddenly someone is incredibly aroused and experiences pleasure. In the same way that, like rubbing someone's arm or having your arm rubbed by someone else, it depends on the person or people who are touching you and your relationship with them and your level of connection and interest and arousal and attraction. So the brain or how we respond emotionally is certainly tied to how we respond to the stimulation that could be pleasurable. And the other part of that is that the part of a body that we're talking about also responds to stress and threat. So if people are feeling anxious or threatened, that part of the body can tighten up. But if we feel relaxed and welcomed, warm connection with other people, sexual arousal, that part of the body starts to relax. And that's when people can experience pleasure without any pain in that part of the body.
Do you find that a lack of education or shame around anal sex interferes with people's ability to fully enjoy it?
Okay, I'm going to say yes, but then I'm going to pause because you mentioned that you participated in this workshop last year,
I did.
and and I've been doing a lot of talking, and it's not really my MO to talk this much in response to questions. I really want to ask other people. So I'm just curious from you, if you're willing to answer this and we can have a little bit of a dialogue. What do you think? And then we can go back and forth about it.
Yeah, I would say in general, like I would say shame, I feel like keeps a lot of people from trying it or being open to trying it because they're like, oh, that's not what that's for. And then I would say lack of education can affect that in that a lot of people don't know about that anatomy wise. Like, especially men will be like, no, there's nothing supposed to ever go in there. But like, okay, that's literally what you just explained. How you experience orgasm is feeling those muscles contract around the
Hmm.
prostate. So obviously stimulating that would be pleasurable. Or yeah, so I would say in those regards, those types of preconceptions can
Yeah.
affect. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of shame around sex in general in the United States. It's not always the same in different subcultures. It's not the same across the world that we experience shame related to sex. But then you take something that's as stigmatized as anal sex, and people tend to not learn information because they experience shame about asking questions about the things that they want to experience or curious about experiencing or have experienced but want to learn more about. And the the evolutionary purpose of shame, at least as I've been taught and learned, is to protect ourselves from rejection from other people, which
Mm.
means that then we retreat from being open with other people about the things that we want to experience or learn about. What I've learned from the science of this that I've done over a number of years is that most people who have anal sex or have experimented with it have learned by trial and error. And they learn by trial and error because they don't have great sources of information or resources of people that they can contact that they think are credible and reliable and have their best interest at heart. So most people are learning from pornography or sources that they can access online now. But then they encounter all sorts of problems. They think, okay, it's supposed to hurt before it's going to be pleasurable, or I just have to tolerate the pain, which is not true. There's really no reason to experience physical pain or emotional pain during anal sex at all. It can be purely pleasurable. But people don't have that little bit of information. They also don't have knowledgeable, credible, reliable sources that are accurate about how to do that, how to approach it in a way that doesn't cause pain. So there's a lot of reason why lack of education and shame are linked together in that question that you asked.
Thank you for that. So next up, let's talk about being clean and comfortable. Anal sex can bring up a lot of concerns around cleanliness. So
Yeah.
what's a realistic way to think about that?
Yeah. I love this question too. When I was doing my dissertation work, I was trying to measure stigma toward anal sex and then see if it had any public health impact. And so to measure it, I was interviewing a bunch of people and then trying to create a scale. And as I was interviewing people, I was just asking them about, what they had learned about anal sex, what their experiences were. And one person was talking about the shame that some people experience about cleanliness. People are concerned about contact with poop, fecal matter, shit, whatever you want to call it. And the concern about that is because if something is going inside of past the anus, the anal opening, and then into the rectum, which is about 5 to 9 inches long, they're concerned that they're going to come in contact with fecal matter.
Hmm.
And one thing that people may not realize is that when you've got enough fiber in your diet, generally, when you've got enough fiber in your diet, then poop that enters the rectum is properly bulky and full. And when you have that experience of like, I've got to go to the bathroom, that's the sense that like poop has actually entered the rectum. And then when you release it, it generally all releases as a whole material or bulky material. And then there's very little, if anything, left inside of the rectum. There's some microscopic bits of fecal matter that can be in there. But in general, if you were to then insert an object into the rectum, you wouldn't come in contact with any visible signs of fecal matter. The problem is that most of us don't have enough fiber in our diets. Also, we've got medical conditions, medications that we take. Irritable bowel syndrome is something that people experience. Gluten allergies, HIV medications themselves sometimes can cause some difficulty with bowel movements, or just living with HIV for a long time can also have an impact on people's bowel movements. So, I'm describing the ideal, right? But
Hmm.
none of us actually live in the ideal. Many of us are living with the reality of like, our poops are not always so clean. When we wipe with a piece of toilet paper, usually there's something left on there, which suggests, oh, there's, something still in there. So that's the reason why this question keeps popping up. Okay. It's a long answer to get to it, but um, you asked specifically, what can people do about it? Right?
Um, so I asked a realistic way to think about that, and actually
Yeah.
you did
Okay.
kind of give like a little, and I think the only thing that I would say I would add to that is that,
Mm,
in general, sex isn't necessarily the cleanest activity, right? There are bodily
yeah.
fluids. And so when we're thinking about anal sex, just because it's a different area of the body and different matter that we're coming into contact with, it's just remembering that we're dealing with human bodies.
Yes. Yes. So I'm so glad that you said that, because
Mhm.
you reminded me. The reason I was talking about that dissertation work and interviews is because there are two things that people said to me in those interviews that really are memorable. One is someone said, or when you're digging for diamonds, every once in a while you're going to encounter coal. And that
Uh,
was this person's way of saying, be realistic. It's part of the body, right? You can experience pleasure, but you might encounter something that you didn't want to encounter, but it doesn't mean that you didn't experience the pleasure. You can still experience the pleasure, even if you do encounter that. And a related story to that is someone telling me he had a sexual experience with someone, and during the experience, he felt like he had a little bit of an accident, and he left some fecal matter on this person's penis. And this guy was mortified that he had done this, just mortified, he said. But then his partner just got up, went over to the kitchen, got a paper towel, wiped it off, came back and said, it's not a problem. And then they just continued to enjoy each other's company. And he said it was a very lovely corrective experience, that he had internalized this message that there's something wrong if that happens, or it's a bad thing. But as you said, Danielle, like sex is not always or sex generally is not a clean endeavor. There are bodily fluids happening. And
mhm.
actually, in fact, we want bodily fluids to happen because you need
Yeah.
them in order to make things fun and lubricated. So, you could be realistic about it and accept it. If you're really concerned about it, then there are, of course, resources of other things you can do. And we can talk about this website we've developed for this project, and where you can learn a little bit more information about that if you want.
Yeah, yeah. And so speaking of things that you can do, douching, is it
Yeah.
necessary?
Well, in a way, we've kind of already answered it, right? It's not
Right?
necessary if you feel comfortable not doing it.
But so if people do want to douche, what are the safest methods and how often should this be performed?
So, in answering this question, I have to preface it by saying there is some scientific information about the topic of douching. And in general, when it comes to anal sex, there's like information we know, information we really don't know, and then somewhere in between, like kind of best practices, a little bit of science there, but we're not completely sure about the best answer. And douching
Mhm.
is one of those. There's been more research in recent years about douching, in part because there are HIV scientists who want to figure out a way to introduce something like pre-exposure prophylaxis or even potentially post-exposure prophylaxis in douches,
Oh, wow.
so that people can like prevent HIV that way. If they're already douching, then it makes sense to do something that, as scientists call, is behaviorally congruent. You're already doing it; it's congruent with what you're already doing. Then let's see if there's a way to help you do that and prevent HIV too. So there's a little bit of research on that. So what I have learned from that is that in general, if you're going to introduce a liquid into the body, it should be just water that's body temperature. You don't need to add anything to it. Just introduce that water into the body. It should be about the size of like like a small bottle of water that you get at a store.
Yeah, like the
That's the
12
size.
ounces.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't remember the number of it. Thank you. So about that size, you hold it in the body for a little bit, you let it evacuate. You can do that two more times. That's generally the rule of thumb that I've learned from people who've been studying rectal douches in the context of trying to come up with what we call microbicide, something that could prevent HIV in the future. But we don't have a lot of great data on that. This is just from those studies that have been conducted so far.
Awesome. Awesome. I didn't even know that they were attempting to put microbicides in douches. Learned something new today.
Yeah, it's been a long, long effort to do that. So to make those available. And in this context around science these days, we don't know what's going to happen to that research or if it's going to continue, but there have been a lot of people who've done a lot of great work on that front.
I want to talk a little bit about lubrication, toys, and protection, but
Hmm.
just to bridge between the conversation about douching and this other conversation, what are some things that people should avoid putting in or around the anus?
Yes. I'm going to make a plug. Pardon the pun. I'm going to make a plug for a podcast that was done a couple of years ago, maybe just a year ago. It's on our website and it's by the Queer Health Podcast. And
Mhm.
just because it says queer health doesn't mean you have to be queer to listen to it. It's just a very thorough discussion about douching and very accessible. It's got resources and links to things too. So we can talk about that. I think maybe in your show notes, we can link to that specific podcast or to our website. So what you do not want to introduce are things that have a lot of sugars or salts in them. You want to just introduce something that's neutral. It's just water. Because if you introduce sugars and salts, it draws out the water that's already in the rectal lining and then can compromise that rectal lining. So this is like high school science that I'm not sure I'm going to remember perfectly, but the term is osmosis. So the water is going to pass through a porous membrane and move into the more concentrated area. So it depletes. There have been some studies that have shown, at least with lubricants, that if you introduce a lubricant that's high in sugars or salts, then it can draw out that liquid and then compromise the lining. So we don't want to do that, is the idea. Some people have concerns about the amount of liquid that they introduce. So I mentioned that the rectum is 5 to 9 inches long. And when I say 5 to 9 inches, I don't mean like it goes from 5 to 9 inches in an individual person and expands. I mean, like there's this human variability and diversity. So in some people, it's 5 inches. In some people, it's 9 inches. In some people, it's shorter. Some people, it's longer. But the reason why we were talking about this 12 ounces is because that's about how much you can hold inside of the rectum. So you want to put in as much as you feel like is comfortable for you to hold, but don't feel like you have to push the entire bottle in. The more liquid that you introduce, the more likely you are to go past the rectum and into what we call the sigmoid colon, which is a little S curve that's up above the rectum. And then that is where there's more likely to be fecal matter waiting to enter the rectum. So we generally want to avoid washing that into the rectum because then you're introducing more fecal matter rather than washing out anything that might be in the rectum.
You talked a little bit about lubes with sugars and salt, and lube can
Hmm.
be very, very good for anal play. So, can you walk us
Yes.
through the types of lube, like water-based, silicone, oil-based, and how to choose the right one?
you said it can be very good, and for many people, it's absolutely essential
Hmm.
because the rectum doesn't really produce a lot of natural lubrication. There's some mucus that it produces, but generally not enough for the friction of stimulation of an object going in and out of the rectum. So people generally then apply some kind of lubricant, and there are, naturally occurring lubricants, for example, saliva, spit. If people are not using a barrier method, pre-ejaculate also can be a source of lubrication. And if people are having vaginal sex and anal sex, it's possible if there's natural lubrication in the vagina, then that can help lubricate inside of the rectum as well. I'm not saying that this is what we recommend and like these are best practices. I'm saying this is realistically what people do. One note on that about vaginal and anal sex is that the bacteria that live in the vagina and the bacteria that naturally live in the rectum, you don't want to introduce bacteria from the rectum into the vagina because you can create UTIs and other issues. The bacteria of the vagina doesn't like to live with the bacteria of the rectum. So basically, in the same way that you would wipe after peeing, you go front to back rather than back to front. So you don't
Yes.
introduce bacteria from the rectum into the vagina, right?
I would like to repeat that because a lot of people engaging in these activities don't seem to understand. You can penetrate the vagina and then subsequently penetrate the anus. Penetrating the anus and subsequently penetrating the vagina is not good, unless you are washing after or in between.
Yes, yes, yes. Gold star to this explanation. Thank you for saying it again. So those are some natural sources of lubrication in the sense of like they're in your bodies already and people tend to use them. But they may not be sufficient to be able to have anal play in a way that feels really like relaxed and comfortable because may not be enough natural lubrication in that way. So then people introduce lubricants, and there are three general types of them. Some people know this already, but some people really haven't heard this. So there are water-based lubricants. They get pretty well absorbed into the body pretty quickly. So if you're going to use a water-based lubricant for anal sex or anal play, then you need to keep repeating the addition of more lubricant, more lubricant, more lubricant, because it will eventually get the water will get absorbed into the body, and then it'll stop having as much of a um, fluid lubricating effect.
It's a little
So
sticky.
then there's yeah, exactly, and it can get a little bit sticky too. And then there are silicone-based lubricants, and silicone-based lubricants are really just tiny, tiny, tiny beads that you can't see, and that, um, as far as we know, don't get absorbed into the body too. And those little beads are just rub up against one another and roll around with one another. But because they're not absorbed into the body, they stay lubricating. So you don't really need to keep adding a lot of silicone-based lubricant, which is why generally people recommend a silicone-based lubricant if you're going to engage in anal play. And then the third option would be an oil-based lubricant. And generally, they're not recommended for anal play because oil can also collect bacteria. And so that may cause some issues in the rectum. But there are some oils that are kind of naturally antibiotic, like coconut oil. So that may be able to be used in anal play without any particular concerns. Remember what I said about like there's the stuff that we know for sure, the stuff we definitely don't know, and then there's the stuff in the middle. This is kind of the stuff in the middle. People certainly have been using oil-based lubricants for anal play. You have to experiment and see what works for you. But there are some words of caution about each of these different options. So if it's water-based lubricant, then you got to be sure that you're continuing to add it repeatedly because it will start to wear off its lubricating effect. So using silicone-based lubricants, there are two things. One is it can stain your sheets. And also, if you're using any kind of silicone-based toy, then you can't use a silicone-based lubricant because it will wear away at the toy and cause it to wear down and fall apart. And then if you're using oil-based lubricants, then if you use a latex condom or glove or some kind of barrier, then oil will wear down on the latex. So you'd want to use water or silicone instead of that.
And then you did mention the concerns with water-based, and this is specifically something I've seen a lot with the sugars and salt going into the anus. A lot of water-based lubricant contains glycerin, which is
Hmm.
essentially a sugar. And that is one of those things that you said can cause that osmosis effect and dry
Hmm.
out the anus.
Exactly. So in the limited studies that have been done about lubricants,
Hmm.
it's the ones that are high in sugars and salts that tend to wear out the lining, right? So exactly what you just said. And the only thing I'm going to add to it, which you may already know yourself too, is that lubricants for sex are not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So it's not like they have to go through extensive testing before they've been introduced to the market. And that also means that a formula, let's say you use ID Lube, which is a brand of lube, this year their ingredients could differ from what they had 2 years ago inside of them because they're not regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So that's another area where we don't know some things, but what we do know is exactly what you said.